Meet Bob Radensky. Bob is 42, married with 3 children. Bob's wife, Mindy, makes choices that bring consequences for Bob, giving him choices that will have consequences. It was and will continue to be a very difficult night for Bob. The rain was pouring down in buckets, and Bob's windshield wipers were working at full power, but they were not very effective. The winds driving the rain pushed Bob's car, causing it to slide along the road. The radio simply filled the hours of driving with noise. Bob could almost hear it through the growing anger of the storm if he tried. The storm was taking its toll on the power lines. Sparks lit up the road as Bob drove around downed wires, uprooted trees, and trash cans blown away by the wind. He clutched the steering wheel, turning pale in his hands. Outside, the wind howled. Sheets of metal roofing flew past. They posed an immediate threat. The wipers continued to beat a rhythm without noticeable effect. Bob finally turned onto his dark street and pulled up to his driveway. There was a red sports car parked in his driveway. Bob braked suddenly, almost crashing into her. Bob is now home, but that hasn't stopped him from having a high-stress, adrenaline-filled day and night. Bob had been on his feet for over 15 hours. He long ago found his second, third, and fourth wind. He was so electrified that he was shaking. He took his large wrench and headed through the storm to his front door. I walked up to the door like a drowned man. My house was dark. I thought it was because of a power outage. I didn't know what I would find. I thought I was ready for anything. I inserted the key into the lock, unlocked it, and began to enter. Sparks flew across the street behind me. The light from the sparks and lightning revealed men's pants, socks, underwear, and a shirt scattered around the living room, as well as a skirt and blouse. I froze. I listened carefully. Finally, I heard the sounds of people having sex through the storm. Lots of oohs and ahs coming from the top floor. I retreated, closing the front door. I was broken. 15 years, well, more precisely 14 years, 7 months and 3 days, of marriage disappeared like smoke. The wind and rain whipped into my face. My stomach was doing somersaults. Sweat appeared on my forehead. I know it doesn't make sense, but I was overcome with a feeling of absolute calm mixed with furious anger. I became very concerned about the safety of some people. I braved the storm and made my way back to my truck and climbed into it. I fired it up and pulled out of the driveway. I turned the wipers to maximum power, but everything was still blurry. True, perhaps it was the tears flowing from my eyes, and not the weather this time. I make it to the end of the street before I completely fall apart. I was a mess. I'm sobbing. My mind was filled with images of my wife joyfully and lustfully entertaining her faceless lover. I opened the car door and stuck my head out to breathe air. The storm hit me in the face. Random thoughts of punishment and revenge echo through my head. I do not think so. No internal reasoning about how close I am to getting the shot. I didn't plan to stay home tonight. Tomorrow was Friday. That's when she thought I was coming home. The storm shut it all down. I spent a grueling 11 hours securing a job site before heading out into the hurricane. I headed home. I was hoping to avoid the trouble outside, only to discover the abomination inside. Honestly, I think that was the moment when I lost my mind. I grabbed the phone and called her. I was pretending. There were no cognitive thoughts in my brain. "Hi, it's Mindy. Sorry, I can't come to the phone right now. Leave me a message. Thank you." I hung up. I was seething. "Hi, it's Mindy. Sorry, I can't come to the phone right now. Leave me a message. Thank you." I hung up again. I turned my truck around and headed back to the house. My phone rang and it was Mindy. I shouted over the noise of the thunderstorm outside. I tried to call and tell them that I would be home soon. Work was stopped due to the storm. I tried to call you twice. "Bob, I'm sorry," she interrupted me. "I was in the bath and just saw you calling." I heard some muffled sounds as if she had hung up and was talking to someone. "Mindy?" I said with a growl in my voice. "Oh, Bob, I'm so glad you're coming home tonight. How long will it take you to get here? The storm is really strong and it would be great if my big guy could come and protect me." This just made me angry. "I'm about 5 minutes from home, but with a thunderstorm, who knows?" I said. She hurried to hang up. "Okay, honey, take care. See you soon." A few moments later, I'm pulled over. I hit the brakes, the engine revs high, the lights are off. I back into the alley that opens onto the road. I watch my porch. My front door opens. My wife looks out, then comes back in and opens my front door to let him out. I see a kiss and a playful slap on my wife's bare ass. He steps back. He air kisses her as my front door closes. He turns and heads to his car, parked in my driveway. He pulls his coat tight and braves the storm to his car. While the storm raged, I waited for him to close the car door. Stepping away from the brake, I stepped on the gas, kicking tails of gravel behind me. Arcs of electrical sparks from dancing power lines and lightning made my goal clear as day. As the storm raged, I waited for him to close the car door. My foot off the brake, I slammed on the gas, sending streams of gravel flying behind me. Arcs of sparks from dancing power lines and lightning illuminated my target like daylight. My truck had a significant amount of weight with all my tools inside. As I cut across the street and pulled up to my driveway, my foot was stuck to the floor. I even shouted, "Bam, speed!" I slammed a red sports car into the garage door. It was in the air when it hit my wife's SUV, which still has 7 damn years to pay off. The front of the small red sports car was crumpled. Her backside crumpled inward. Think about an accordion. She bounced back to me and my truck got a second chance. When everything stopped moving, I assessed the damage. The impact was strong enough that even the side airbags deployed. Cool. I turned on the high beams. The little red sports car got smaller. The fastening areas have been fully utilized. I could see his head. He didn't move. Crap. I killed him. Crap. I sat in my truck, collecting my thoughts. I noticed that I was not hurt, but I was filled with rage equal to the storm. She was in a panic. Her hot, rich lover was enjoying her hysterics because her husband was just moments away from home. In fact, he was laughing at her. He asked what she expected, having sex with him in her husband's bed. He thought it was funny. She had to promise him a lot. Finally, she almost managed to drive him out of the house. She opened the front door a crack, stuck her head out, and looked around the street. No sign of Bob's truck. She breathed a sigh of relief when she finally shooed him out the door. She ran upstairs to take off the bedding. She hadn't even made it to the bedroom before the whole house shook. The noise made less of an impression on her. Her first thought was that a big old elm tree had fallen on the house. She ran downstairs. Through the living room window, she saw that the old elm tree was still standing, fighting the storm. Bob sat in his truck, looking at the destruction that was his garage. Its high beam illuminated the damage in full relief. Bob grabbed his large flashlight and climbed out of the truck. He looked around the front of his truck. He was impressed. He looked on the move. He then walked towards the crushed red sports car. Bob reached through the broken driver's window. The guy came to his senses. This answered that question. Bob grabbed the guy's head and started slamming his face into the steering wheel. Bob's wife's scream caught his attention. Bob pulled himself out of the red sports car and saw his wife standing naked in the kitchen doorway, screaming. Her hair was a mess. She got to the kitchen and opened the door to the garage. The truck's headlights blinded her. At first, all she saw was her wrecked car. It made her scream. She then noticed a wrecked red sports car. Then an ominous dark figure highlighted by the headlights. Lightning exploded, splitting the old elm tree in front of the house. A long flash of lightning revealed a dark figure as her husband. The pitch of Mindy's scream increased. She fainted. The fury of the storm intensified. The picnic bench flew into the air, spinning and rolling as it made its way down the street. A 204 board flying through the air punched a hole in the garage wall. The howl of the wind became deafening. Bob watched his wife fall. The crushed sports car swallowed the ass. It would take the pliers of life to open this tin, Bob thought. Bob headed towards the door. He needed to close it. As angry as he was, breaking through the storm was high on his list of tasks. The breach, which was a garage door, breached the shell of the house. With this breach, the storm will begin to tear the house apart. Bob was in damage control mode. Bob reached the door, grabbed his wife's hand, and pulled her back into the kitchen. He closed the door and moved the refrigerator to help keep the door closed. He turned on the flashlight and looked around. It was calm inside. The storm remained outside. Bob called 911. Nothing. He looked at his phone. No network. He picked up his wife and carried her to the downstairs bathroom. He did not very carefully throw it into the bath. He sat on the toilet, thinking about how his life had become a nightmare. He heard something hit the house. He could feel his house starting to fall apart. Bob looked at his wife. "Bob, I'm so—" "Just shut up," Bob shouted through the storm. "Haven't you caused enough trouble?" She shrank into herself. The storm could be heard tearing their home apart, even though they were huddled together in the small, dark bathroom, lit only by Bob's flashlight. They were miles apart. Bob did his best to control his anger. Bob's wife's mind was spinning. She couldn't calm down. She was emotionally exhausted, psychologically unstable, and also physically exhausted. She was hungry after all the sex. She was cold and naked, shivering in the bath. She saw the rage in Bob's eyes. She was afraid. I was afraid to provoke him, so I kept my mouth shut. There wasn't much talking in the bathroom. Bob broke the silence. "Why?" She lowered her head, tears falling like rain outside. "What's his name?" "Richard," she mumbled. "Is this going on long?" "Only a couple of weeks." "You love him?" "No, it was just for sex," she sobbed, feeling another piece of their marriage being torn away. She continued, "Bob, what's wrong with Richard?" The words caught in her throat. You killed him?" After a moment of silence, Bob looked at her. "What do you care about that? He was just for sex." The silence that fell between Bob and Mindy was interrupted only by the squealing of boards being torn from their house by the storm. "No," Bob said after a rather long pause. His no was also a response to the pain in Bob's heart. Bob turned off the flashlight to save battery. No more words were spoken, no more thoughts were shared. It was a dark, ugly silence between them. After some time, Mindy spoke. "Bob, for your sake, not for me or him, but for your sake, you can't leave him there. You're not the kind of person who would leave any person there." She spoke pleadingly. The worst part was that she knew her husband, and she was right. If he had left Richard to suffer his deserved fate, Mindy was sure that, deep down, he would never have forgiven himself. This very short conversation ended when another part of the old elm crashed into the living room. The consequences have now forced Bob to make his choice to leave the relative safety of the bathroom and face the raging storm. Through the destruction of his home to save the life of a man who was complicit in unleashing the storm in Bob's head, heart, home, and family. What a test it was for Bob. Bob walked through the ruined living room where his mother's chair, Bob's only tangible connection with his poor late saintly mother and her family, lay broken into small pieces, crushed by such a large old elm branch. In the bathtub, safe from the storm, Bob's wife was in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of the storm outside. There was a painful awareness within her that she was on the very edge of destruction. Her insides were churning. Mindy and her mind were as much a mess as her home, an old elm that had survived decades of storms. But this storm was the end for the old elm. When Bob finally moved the refrigerator away from the door, he was able to reach his garage. It was a complete mess. The roof was torn off, one wall stood, the other simply disappeared. What was left of the garage door was sandwiched between Mindy's little red sports car and SUV. It fluttered like a flag in the wind. Everything in the garage was exposed to the fury of the storm. Everything that was not tied down was carried away with the wall. His truck, rocking and rolling, still held all the cars in place. His wife's SUV was pinned against the back wall. The red sports car was still hanging on. The front bumper of Bob's truck was holding the back of the little red sports car down. Bob looked into the sports car. The guy didn't look very good. He was as pale as a sheet. The wind picked up strength and attacked again. The wind picked up the small sports car, lifting it up and down, throwing it everywhere, pushing its passenger into everything. His head nodded like a doll's. Bob tried to open both doors. They didn't give in. Bob headed to his truck for better tools than just his hands. He grabbed his miner's lamp helmet, utility knife, hammer, and 5-foot breaker, and walked back to the sports car. He ended up having to break the windshield. He then cut Richard out of the seatbelt and pulled him through the windshield, through what was left of the hood, then threw him to the floor. Bob dragged him back through the kitchen, ignoring the closed door, through the old elm tree in the living room and back into the cramped bathroom where he dropped Richard on the floor. He looked at his wife. "Satisfied now?" Bob, sitting on his toilet, looked at his watch. He had just arrived home a little over an hour ago. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Sometime around 4 a.m., they felt the worst of the storm had passed. Richard woke up. It seemed to Bob that he wouldn't shut up. Richard really was a fool. Richard went overboard when he told Bob in detail what a slut his wife was. He took pleasure in twisting the knife in the wound. That was always the best part of dealing with wives, destroying the husband. Richard enjoyed it all. A dispassionate observer would be justified in assuming that Richard had a death wish. Bob's wife was sobbing but didn't say anything. That spoke volumes to Bob. All good things come to an end, so is this night. Around 6 a.m., Bob kicked down the bathroom door and walked into the ruins of what was there. Bob looked around. The entire front facade of his house, as well as almost all of the walls of his garage, were simply gone. Ruin was a good word for it. His cell phone had 2 bars of charge. He called 911. When he finished the call, he headed to his truck. When Bob got into the truck, all he knew for sure was that he needed to be somewhere else. Mindy stayed with her parents and their children. There was nowhere else to go. There the children survived the storm. This was Mindy's only shelter after the storm. She didn't explain why Bob wasn't around. The aftermath of the storm had left so much to do. Mindy hadn't been pressed too hard on the issue just yet. Mindy, deep down, was scared. Losing Bob, become a single mother of 3 children. It's not like she and Bob were swimming in money. Things were tight, which is why Bob took those jobs away from home. Although he didn't like it, he did it for the sake of his family. The family could not have survived without their combined efforts. Mindy hasn't heard from Bob for 3 days. There was all this chaos with the insurance agents. Her father was helping her with it. The children's school was badly damaged, so they were in the way. Mindy's mom took care of her grandchildren. Mindy didn't know what to do, so she just tried to take it step by step. Bob was several studies away, actually. Bob in the bar of the Ramada Hotel, where he was quickly becoming a regular, reflected on his life, staring into an almost empty glass of whiskey. Bob began to view Ralph, the bartender, in an almost mystical sense. Every time Bob's glass of whiskey was near the end, Ralph would appear and the glass of whiskey would be filled again, as if by magic. No words were exchanged, almost as if Ralph could read his mind, his wife, his children. Bob was lost. He wanted revenge. Bob was angry. Bob was also amazed. He just couldn't reconcile the wife he knew, loved, and respected, the mother of his children, his partner, his best friend, with all the nonsense Richard was spewing all that long night in the bathroom. His mind was reeling from the consequences of other people's choices as he sipped his whiskey. But in reality, it was his ego that was bruised and battered. He began to see this as, through the bottom of the glass of whiskey he held in his hand, he scanned the now smoldering heap that was his life. His wife became a cheater. How did that hurt him? Okay, more sex with the mother of his children, that was obvious. He could find sex in other places. After all, he had 2 good hands. He didn't own his wife, and if she wanted to be a slut, was that really on him? He clearly shouldn't have interfered. He didn't want to look. The images in his own imagination were bad enough. If he were on the other side of the world and she was having sex, would a tree fall in the forest? But he felt offended. So what now? She offended him. It was disgusting. But how could this be healed? You can't go back in time and make your wife not a cheater. And then there were the children. And his glass suddenly filled up again. And this is where the road meets the rubber. Bob found enough distance to allow him to gain perspective. Sometime around 10 a.m., After breakfast at the Ramada coffee shop, Bob hit the road, returning from the aftermath of the storm. Traveling 2 states with a clear head and an extra-large glass of coffee to go gives a person time to think. Time to try to get my head straight. Bob faced some very serious questions. Divorce, although the obvious path they could have taken, was a bad choice in Bob's clear, detached state of mind. It was not possible to support 2 farms. There was simply not enough money. One was difficult. The children needed more care than he could provide to keep the family afloat. At 12, 9, and 5 years old, there were many years of parenthood ahead. Bob also had to admit that he needed to know where Mindy was. Was she devoted to the children or to Richard? He couldn't see it as anything other than making one choice or another for her. If she chose children, what does that mean? And who the hell is Richard? The man was a massive jerk. He needed to figure it out. It was already late when Bob drove up to his wife's relatives. He believed that was where Mindy hid the children the night of the hurricane. He didn't call ahead. He'll use the surprise to wrest some more truth out again. The last hour or so of Bob's trip showed the complete devastation of the hurricane. Several roads are still blocked. Bob had to spend time going back. Arriving at his wife's relatives, he saw that their house looked pretty good, possibly roof repairs. He parked his truck, walked up the porch steps, crossed the porch, and opened the door, just like he had done for years. He entered the living room, and there was pandemonium. Children were all around Bob. The hugs began. Bob looked at the smiling and loving faces of his children. He looked at the worried faces of his relatives, then saw Mindy's face. Her eyes were huge. She was very pale, and her jaw dropped. They looked at each other, Mindy sobbing, breaking eye contact, and heading to the bedroom. It took a while for things to calm down. Bob looked around. The children were in a good place. Mindy was safe. Bob says goodbye to his children and in-laws. Mindy looks out from the darkened bedroom and watches her husband leave. Bob became a resident at the Residence Inn. They have a good corporate weekly rate. His boss got it for him. So there are new expenses. The good news is that Bob's work saved the company a lot of money, so he was promoted. This could lead to more travel. Mindy still hasn't gotten over anything with her parents. She also didn't have the inner strength to face Bob. Mindy is just this side of crazy town. All that really mattered to her was family. And it was in a sorry state, by her own hands. The weight of her guilt, the sad eyes of her children, the confused faces of her parents, and worst of all, the dead face of her husband. This was her personal hell. It swirled around in her mind and lodged itself in her soul. And so things continued. Bob received the first installment of his damages from his homeowner's insurance. This allowed him to begin restoring his home. FEMA money began arriving at the end of the month. This helped with everything else. Bob's buddy Ike was a contractor, so the weekend was mostly a Bob and Ike show. Ike's crew moved forward throughout the week as needed while Bob was at his day job. Within a month, real progress was made in the house. Bob was adding an apartment to the back of the house, and the basement was a new basement that could one day become a man cave. Direct access was available through a hatch in the floor. The other entrance was from the kitchen, down the stairs into a hallway that ran underneath the house. Both the in-laws' room and the basement had combination locks both inside and outside the doors. On weekends, Bob's parents brought lunch and children. Bob looked forward to these dinners all week. Years later, Bob was heard saying that these dinners were some of the best times of his life. After 3 months, Bob and Ike could see the finish line. Mindy came over for lunch, but she still couldn't talk to Bob, so she just sat in the car, watching her family recover. Nevertheless, she came out. It was a step. At the end of the 4th month, the house was restored. Thanks to Ike's help and Bob's sweat, Bob was able to expand the house and fix everything else using only the insurance proceeds. Moving home would allow Bob to save money on housing. Even at the corporate rate, it was expensive. Bob began saving again, just like when he and Mindy first started. But only Bob moved home. Bob and his children were ready. However, without someone to care for the children during the week, it simply wouldn't work. The parents were wonderful, but they were older, and having 3 noisy children constantly running and jumping was clearly wearing on them. They never said anything, but Bob had eyes. Bob knew it was time to talk to Mindy. Bob decided that they needed to talk in their house if they were ever going to get their lives back. Bob was more than ready to move on. Bob talked to his in-laws. They acted as go-betweens since Mindy hadn't spoken to Bob in months. The time, place, and other details were agreed upon. It was Saturday. Bob had been living in the restored house for 2 weeks. Mindy drove her parents' car to the house. She parked on the street. She couldn't bring herself to pull into the driveway. She packed lunch in a picnic basket. Bob left the front door open. It was a thoughtful gesture on Bob's part. Mindy brought the friyad chicken and all the trimmings. This was Bob's favorite dish. She even brought cherry pea. They had unsweetened tea, just the way Bob liked it. Mindy was dressed nicely, conservatively. She left the top 3 buttons undone, showing a little cleavage which Bob also liked. She was a little too thin. Her smile was a little tense, but her eyes, although beautiful as always, darted back and forth like those of a small prey animal, always on the alert and ready to run, so to speak. It was good that they were eating. It gave Mindy something to do with her hands. They ate in silence. They finished lunch, and Mindy got up to clean up. It's time to cross the Rubicon. Bob reached out and grabbed Mindy's wrist. "Leave it. It's time for us to talk," Bob said softly. Mindy sat back down in her folding chair by the filing table. "Mindy, let me start. If you don't agree with anything I say, just let me know. You don't have to explain why you don't agree. I just want to see if we can agree on something, okay?" Mindy didn't know what this day would mean for her. She was on edge. She didn't sleep all night. She just couldn't say a word, so she nodded. Bob and Mindy looked into each other's eyes. They each had questions that neither of them wanted to answer. Bob took a deep breath and began. "Mindy, the most important thing to me is our family. The children are what I care about first." Bob looked at Mindy. She simply nodded. Bob took this as agreement. "You know, like me, things have been tight money-wise for quite some time. The only way we kept afloat was the extra money I made from these damn jobs away from home. The storm didn't help." Bob did pause. Mindy nodded. "With you taking care of the kids and your part-time job, well, it helps, but not that much. You didn't even make enough to pay for your car, and if we had to pay someone for childcare..." Bob left the sentence unfinished. Mindy wasn't stupid. She knew what their situation was. "So for the kids, the least painful way is for us to stay together." Mindy couldn't believe Bob was talking about staying together. This was the answer she had prayed to God for. It took her a minute to answer. She jumped up and tried to hug her husband. More than anything, she longed for his hug so she could return home from this nightmare. Bob raised his hand like a police officer making a traffic stop. "Don't touch me." Mindy collapsed back into her chair. Bob continued, "Mindy, it is clear that you are not worthy of trust. Although I love you, my trust in you is gone. I don't know if I will ever recover from the pain you caused me." Bob allowed a little of his anger to come out. Mindy stumbled back in shock, her eyes getting even bigger. Tears started to fall down her face. But let's leave that aside for now. Bob was clearly trying to control his anger. So now it's a question of how we move forward with our lives. Bob took a deep breath and continued. "Mindy, the idea of leaving you alone with the kids while I work away from home, without precautions, would be stupid of me. Honestly, it would also drive me crazy." Bob looked into Mindy's eyes. "And before any trust is given to you, not me, have a lot of work to do. I'm not sure we'll survive a repeat of the night of the storm. I'm also not sure I'll ever trust you again." Bob stood up and went to the refrigerator. He took out a beer on ice. There was no longer a refrigerator in the house. He placed one beer in front of Mindy. "You'll need this for the next part." Bob took a long sip of his beer. "Being away from home, what's stopping you from just reconnecting with Richard? And more importantly, how can I deal with this while I'm at work?" Those are a couple of questions we need to answer. Mindy, I don't believe a word of it. What are you saying? I know that you are a traitor who willingly puts her children's future in danger, and when it comes to me, well, disrespect. I'm not even sure I ever want to touch you again. But this is not fair. We are husband and wife. I'm not going to accept celibacy, especially after I had to listen to your lover describe your actions in great detail. Honestly, I believe his version of events more than anything you can say. So, we need to help me overcome my disgust for you. So today, after you leave, I want you to write, in great detail, all the sexual acts you performed and all the promises you made to Richard. Don't miss anything. Don't worry about how it will affect me. Consider this your first tiny step toward restoring something between us. The full truth, the whole truth, without embellishment. And it must be true, because I'm going to test it. I expect this tomorrow morning. Leave this on the way to church with the kids. Mindy just smiled. So far, do you agree with everything I said? Mindy smiled. No, Mindy, you need to say it. Now. Yes, Bob, Mindy said in a quiet little girl voice. I cannot hear you. Yes, Bob. Mindy, I can't hear you. Yes, Bob, Mindy screamed, shocking even herself. Anything, please, Bob, anything, she continued. It was the most she had said to him since she had begged him to save her lover. Now go. Mindy left with tears in her eyes. Bob took another beer. The remaining half of the package was the next item on Bob's to-do list. The next morning, Mindy and the kids pulled up to the house. This time, she pulled up to the entrance. The kids were pretty happy to be home, and with both their parents, it wasn't lost on Mindy or Bob. Bob took Mindy's letter. Although they didn't really have any furniture, Bob decided it was time for his entire family to sleep under one roof. He told the kids after church to pack up and move home. It would be like camping, but at least they would be together. That night, after getting the kids settled in sleeping bags and air mattresses, Bob and Mindy had their sleeping bags without the air mattresses. There were no conversations. Mindy fell asleep crying. The next morning, everyone drank milk and cereal. The children were given money for a hot lunch and boarded the school bus. Bob took 2 weeks off from work. With his new position, they were paying him. They said, consider it a paid vacation. Bob had never had anything like this before. As soon as the children left, the parents arrived. They were there to help Mindy set up her house. They brought some of their old things to help Bob and Mindy. Bob left for a meeting soon after. It soon became clear that the real reason Mindy's parents were coming was that Mindy wasn't supposed to be alone. It turns out her parents didn't trust Mindy any less than Bob did. Bob decided he needed to learn more from Richard. In a move that turned out to be ingenious upon closer inspection, motivated by Bob's base instincts, he met Richard. Bob found this very educational. They met at Ika Sr.'s diner on the wrong side of town. Richard arrived with 2 huge thugs, a reasonable precaution given the circumstances. Richard didn't look any worse. True, his nose now deviated a little to the left, but the new dentures, Bob admitted, were good. It was as if Bob had never slammed Richard's face into the steering wheel. The thugs remained outside in their nondescript SUV. Richard arrived in a red Ferrari. The meeting was a little tense at first, but Richard's ego got the better of Bob if he didn't lose his cool. Bob played nice. He even offered us the first jug of beer. By the 3rd pitcher and about halfway through Mindy's letter, they were deep into male bonding. Bob listened and recorded on his phone. And Bob, he learned a lot from Richard. By the 4th pitcher, Richard was really starting to show off. How he chose a slut, what signs he looked for, his keen eye and innate sense of a woman's true needs, and how Richard could bend and shape them to suit his needs. After the 5th jug, Richard and Bob went their separate ways. Richard felt that he had found a friend. Bob felt like he had taken a bath in a damp sewer. Bob now knew that Mindy was being honest. Mostly. He gave her an A for effort. It must have hurt like hell to write this letter. Bob wondered what she left out or toned down. This confirmed several things about Mindy for Bob. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Bob took Mindy to the new parents' annex. The door was locked with a combination lock. Bob entered the code and let Mindy inside. The annex was already furnished with a huge four-post bed. There was a sitting area with a chair and footstool, a small coffee table with an iPad on it, a dressing room, and a large bathroom with a jacuzzi. Mindy was a little taken aback. "Mindy, this is where I'll sleep alone. There's a little white button on the wall in our old bedroom. If you press it, it'll send a signal here." Mindy nodded. She wasn't sure what to think. Where did Bob get the money? He then directed her to the iPad. He turned it on, tapped it a few times, and there they were on the iPad. Bob explained, again, that he didn't trust her. He explained how he had equipped the house with video cameras and sound. Everything was transmitted wirelessly to his iPad. Thus, whether at home or away, he could monitor what was happening. He was also able to receive broadcasts on his new iPhone. Mindy was shocked by the level of surveillance. It started to seem like she might not realize how much she had hurt Bob. He then sent her to bed with instructions to sound a signal when she woke up. After the kids left for school, Bob sat down with Mindy for another conversation. Bob's conversations these days were nothing Mindy wanted. "Mindy, according to your letter and your lover, you are completely slutty at your core. One of the things I've learned is that I need to see things as they are. You're a great mom. As far as I can tell, before Richard, you were a good wife and partner, so I saw you as I wanted to see you, the woman I married. Now I see you more clearly. I know you well enough to know that if you choose to suppress the libertine within you, it will come out in a terrible way, just like with Richard. So from now on, we will include slutty as part of your household duties. My room code is 6942. Like you, I have a button on the wall in my bedroom. When I want you, I will give you a signal." And so began Mindy's training. Bob started slow with Mindy. That night, he signaled her at 4 a.m. She arrived a few minutes later, sleepy and in her nightgown. Bob told her to never wear anything when she was in his room. She folded her nightgown and left it on the floor. Bob signaled to her all week, often several times a night. Bob was a strict teacher. It was Sunday morning, and Bob was going back to work that day. The father-in-law and mother-in-law picked up the children and took them to church. Bob and Mindy had several things to do. About an hour after the father-in-law and children left, Bob and Mindy, wearing a decent conservative housewife's dress with nothing underneath, arrived at the hole. Mindy started to get nervous. Bob didn't let it slow him down. Bob dragged Mindy to the piercing studio. Bob arranged everything in advance. The next week was crazy for both Bob and Mindy. Bob couldn't concentrate on his work. He checked his phone every few minutes like a teenage girl. His calls to her drove Mindy crazy. Hell, she couldn't even go to the bathroom without thinking about her husband watching her. Bob spent the entire night reviewing the camera footage, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Of course, the next day, exhausted from lack of sleep, he was even worse at work. By Wednesday, his boss was fed up with Bob. He sent Bob home for the rest of the week, and the next 2 weeks. He told Bob to collect his thoughts. He could hire just as good workers, with much less hassle. But he liked Bob and felt for him. This was his third marriage. But either Bob will come to his senses, or he shouldn't come back. This was definitely not paid time off. Mindy reflected on her situation. She loved Bob to death. She wanted her family, but Mindy had needs. Mindy came to understand her sexual desires. True, having sex with Bob didn't feel like a punishment, she admitted to herself. But somehow, she had to figure out something to make it work, because it really wasn't working. The good news, as Mindy thoroughly explored her desires, was that it involved sex. Mindy realized that if she could just get Bob to take the lead and play his cards right, she knew for sure that she could be one man's woman and not a slut. With this self-awareness, Mindy had something to work with. Mindy moved into the planning phase of her surgery. She figured she would have a full week before Bob returned home. From her second-floor bedroom window, Mindy saw Bob's truck pull up to the house a few days earlier. Mindy waited 5 minutes before pressing the button, signaling Bob. She beeped again, then again. Still nothing. She waited. She was worried. She was scared, but she decided to give her husband space. As she was getting into bed, he signaled to her. Mindy went downstairs and stood in front of Bob's door. Mindy folded her nightgown and placed it on the table next to the door to Bob's room. She punched in the code and opened the door. Bob was lying on the bed, curled up. His sobs tore Mindy's heart apart. Mindy rushed towards him, making soothing noises. It didn't work. Bob exploded like Krakatoa. "They sent me home from work." This was a huge humiliation for Bob. Bob never failed at his job. Mindy sighed, hand to lips. She knew her husband. "Why? Let me tell you, Mindy. Because I had to watch you. I can't trust you. I couldn't stop. God, how can I live like this?" Mindy recoiled in realization of how badly her husband was hurt. But although her plan was not fully formed, she had been digging for it for some time. Why not? She thought to herself. She had nothing to lose. The way Bob was walking now, she assumed things would go south pretty soon. She felt that Bob was ready to kick her out the door. This shouldn't have happened. "Bob, I think I know how to make you trust me, and I think I've come up with a way to prove to both of us that I can be faithful." Mindy made the most of the moment. She told Bob about her deep thoughts about her sexual needs. She loved sex. But one thing she was absolutely sure of was that she only wanted Bob. But she really, really needs Bob to start making an effort. Without Bob's attention, well, they were doomed. Bob explained how leaving her was driving him crazy. He just couldn't trust her. It tore him apart. Every day he wondered if today was the day Richard would get his wife back. If he couldn't work away from home, well, they were doomed. That's when Mindy suggested a test. A test to prove to Bob that she can safely be alone and won't cheat on him. She proudly declared that she could stand up to Richard if only Bob would do his part. It took Bob and Mindy several hours to discuss everything. They both knew that Mindy had to pass this test with flying colors in order for Bob to step back from the cliff. They also prepared for this using every possible precaution. Ultimately, Mindy's idea was so crazy that it might work. For Bob, this little test that Mindy came up with was dangerous. If she had failed, Bob would have neither Hollywood nor a happy ending. There were two huge problems. Firstly, who will be the tester? Secondly, in order for the test to be real, Mindy couldn't have Bob around. He couldn't use his surveillance systems for a whole week. He needed a clean break from watching Mindy. He had to do this, otherwise he wouldn't have a job. A whole work week. It was a long time to leave Mindy unattended. This really scared Bob because at this point, despite Mindy's good intentions, her involvement with Richard showed both Bob and Mindy that she could return to her past behavior at any moment. They talked until late in the evening. Finally, around 11 p.m., they completed their preparations with passionate, angry sex. It was one of the best nights they had spent together in a long time. It's been a busy 2 weeks for Bob. He had a lot to think about. It was all a test of intuition. Win or lose, Bob couldn't have come up with a better plan. He felt sad as he finished his preparations. Bob and Mindy sent the kids to church camp for 3 weeks. It was Thursday, and Bob was due back at work on Monday. Bob finished around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By 4, Bob had become an evil sexual villain towards Mindy. In addition to sleeping, eating, and going to the toilet, they had sex. It was early Friday evening. Mindy, of course, was home alone when the doorbell rang. Mindy was dressed like a housewife when she opened the front door. Richard stood there, very confident. Mindy pulled herself together. She gathered her inner strength. She slammed the door in Richard's face. She locked the front door and bolted it. She leaned against the door, thinking about Richard. He was a wizard in bed. Richard knocked on the front door for almost 20 minutes before walking around the house looking in the windows. When he walked up to the window of his son-in-law's new room and looked at it, a wide smile appeared on his face. He started knocking on the window. Mindy either ignored him or didn't know he was there. He tried to catch Mindy's eye, but when he looked into her eyes, they were glassy and did not express any reconciliation with him. It was Friday evening. Bob was returning home from work. It's been a tough week for Bob. He found Richard, bribed him, and fired him like a guided missile aimed straight at Mindy. According to the plan, he did not look at the CCTV footage on his phone. It was hard for Bob not to look, but since he didn't, he still had a job to do. He drove up to his house. It was dark. Bob had a bad feeling. He unlocked the front door and entered. He turned on the light. No Mindy. Bob was crushed. Deep down, he really hoped that Mindy would be home. This is not true, so she must have left with Richard. She chose him over Bob and the children. Bob resigned himself to the bitter task of telling his children that their mother was no more. It was as if the entire planet Earth lay on his shoulders. Tired, he headed to his bedroom. He could barely put one foot in front of the other. Mindy looked at Bob and said, "Oh, Bean, glory God, you're home." 3-5. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.